speaker.
Hi, our speaker for today's webinar is Connie Anderson, Ph.D. Connie is assistant professor at Towson University in Maryland. She previously researched bullying and autism as part of the team at the Interactive Autism Network, or IAN. She's now director of the Post-Baccalaureate Certificate Program in Autism Studies at Towson University and coordinator of the minor in Applied Adult Disability Studies there. It's our extreme pleasure to have Connie with us today. So without further ado, take it away.
Oh, and there's the results of our poll. So this is wonderful. I can see who's here with us today. There we go. Hi, everyone. Again, this is Connie Anderson at Towson University. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon and for us to talk about bullying and the autism spectrum. Cheryl already gave me a lovely introduction. I wanted to add that I am also the mother of a 23-year-old who was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome when he was 4. So I have some perspectives from the family perspective as well as the researcher perspective. For starters, we're going to do a poll, another poll, just to find out a little bit about your own experience of bullying. There we go. So here's the poll. If you guys would please check all that apply. We'll just give it a second. And I'll show you the results as soon as we've given it a minute. We're wondering if you were bullied as a child or teen, if you witnessed it of others, if your child on the spectrum has been bullied, or has been a bully, because that happens too sometimes, or at least they've been perceived as a bully. Still coming in, slowing down. All righty, let me go ahead and share the results with you. All right, let's look at this. Look how many folks, more than half, were bullied themselves as a child or teen. Even more witnessed the bullying of others. Almost half have had their child on the spectrum bullied, and a few have had their child been either bullied or been perceived as a bully, and we'll talk about how that happens as we get into the talk today. Let me close our poll. Go on to our talk. So bullying and autism spectrum, you can see it's a major issue across the world, right? Across every community, bullying happens. But for children with disabilities, and particularly autism spectrum disorder, they're especially vulnerable. We'll be talking about why that happens. What we're going to cover today is what bullying is, types of bullying, roles taken in that bullying dynamic, how common it is overall, and in those with disabilities and the autism spectrum specifically. We just saw in the poll, it's definitely common. Risk factors associated with becoming a victim or becoming a bully for that matter, consequences of bullying, and also possible interventions at multiple levels, because it's a complex issue that really has a lot of pieces beyond just the individuals involved. So let's start with just a definition. First of all, bullying has to occur repeatedly. So one incident of teasing or one shove on the playground doesn't quite constitute bullying. It's repeated, therefore it becomes dreaded, all right, by the victim. It must involve a power differential where the victim is perceived as less powerful than the aggressor. And that can be physically powerful. Maybe the aggressor is a big guy and the victim is a small person. Maybe it's psychologically, where one is very overt and loud and one is shy and retiring and withdrawn. Maybe it's socially. Maybe one is brand new to the school, doesn't know a soul there. Maybe they don't speak English, right? So in any way, we've got that victim in a less powerful position. Bullying takes many forms, right? Most obviously aggression, but also threats, teasing, gossiping, shunning, and using looks and gestures to deride. So imagine a child walks into a classroom and a bunch of the kids turn their backs or whisper and giggle into their hands or roll their eyes. that can be devastating, to the person it's happening to. Cyberbullying makes this all worse for people. Back in the day, when I was bullied in middle school, which I sadly was, I could get on the school bus, go home, and be safe in my room and feel like, well, they can't get me here, But for the kids today, there is no safe haven. They can be reached through their phone, through a text. They can be reached through all the social media. It makes the shame aspect of bullying so much worse. Let's say that you were, they threw a dodgeball at you in the locker room or something, and 5 people saw it. Well, the shame and humiliation aspect that goes with bullying is bad enough for those 5 people looking and all the people they're going to tell. But with social media, that humiliation can be shared with the whole school fast as lightning. Some of the roles that occur, they're fairly obvious ones are, first of all, the bullies. And they come in 3 general types. The first type is the aggressive, that overt, obvious bully, like the picture here, shoving the guy's head in the locker. That's your aggressive, kind of classic picture of a bully. There's also the followers who kind of follow along and help and encourage that person. There's all kinds of hypotheses about why they do that, partly for status, partly to ensure they don't become a victim, that they're part of that in-group. There's also relational bullying, which is very covert and indirect, back to the gossiping and the shunning, right? That is something associated not exclusively, but often with girls. Clearly, school personnel are going to have an easier time recognizing overt, aggressive bullying if they're there to see it, right? And less able to see the cyber piece and the relational piece that goes on. Victims also come in 3 types. The passive type, they haven't provoked anybody. They haven't done anything. For some reason, they were an easy target. Again, less powerful. Maybe they had few verbal skills or few friends or were different in some way. They might be poorer than the rest of the kids. Maybe they're dressed in hand-me-downs, whatever. The provocative victim antagonizes and incites the bullies, and we'll talk some more about that in a minute. The relational victim is caught in those larger social dynamics beyond his or her control. Picture a queen bee in the head of a clique, and someone at the periphery of the clique is suddenly cast out and becomes a target of the whole clique. That's what relational bullying is like, and those victims are like. Bystanders can be part of the problem or solution. In this, you probably can't see very well, but the little guys in the background, most are saying, fight, fight, fight. And one is saying, stop. They definitely have a role to play, and we're going to talk about them some more as we get to the solution piece. It's important to talk about bully victims, which is another term for that provocative victim that kind of incites the bully. It's a child who is bullied and bullies others. They're not the alpha, like the kid who's the classic bully. They're not social climbing and putting someone down to increase their status. They're reactive and impulsive. They misinterpret that peers intend them harm, sometimes when it wasn't actually the case, and respond aggressively. This quote by Berger captures it perfectly. He says, they are disruptive and impulsive, with poor social and problem-solving skills. Their parents punish them, their teachers dislike them, and their peers do not want to play with them. They insult bullies or retaliate ineffectively, goading their attackers and alienating other children. So these kids have the worst of both worlds. Well, how often does it occur? We know that bullying is very common. Just look at our poll that we just did. In the U.S., typically developing students surveyed about their current term in school, 10.6 of typically developing kids had been bullied that semester, almost 1 in 10, or actually 1 in 10. 13% had bullied, and 6.3% both, which would usually mean they're probably bully victims. Looking at children with disabilities, another study found that in the current or past school year, they were bullied at a high rate. In elementary school, a quarter of them. Middle school, a third of them. And high school, back to a quarter. I guess it wouldn't surprise anybody that middle school was the peak. It's just a terrible time for bullying. But for our purposes today, probably the most interesting thing to come out and sad thing to come out of this study is that the greatest risk of repeated victimization fell to children with autism spectrum disorders in elementary and middle school. Of everyone with all the disabilities at all the ages, was them. One study specifically looking at students with ASD found 46.3% were victims, almost half. That was within the past school year. And again, numbers vary because of the approach of the researchers and the kids they're looking at and the age and all that. That victimization rate, and this was for teens, was substantially higher than that 10.6 for typically developing students. You see here we still have bully victims. Bully victims are a phenomenon, and whenever you go to measure bullying, you're going to find them in the mix. In the study that we did at Ian, and this was a study based on parent surveys. The parents filled out a survey about bullying for their child on the spectrum and also for their other children, their typically developing children. We found 38% had been bullied in the past month, and 9.3% had bullied others, some of which were bully victims. A quick look at our early data showed us that the children on the spectrum were being bullied about 3 times the rate of their typically developing siblings. If you look at the orange pie piece, you can see that clearly here. Well, you know, the numbers are fine. We know there's a lot of it, and that's miserable. But to give you more of the flavor, I'm bringing in some incidents that were reported in an interview study about children with Asperger's who had been bullied. You can see here one child walked into the room to find the eyes had been scratched out of his picture on the classroom bulletin board. One was provoked, told to run like a bull, then taunted that he was a freak when he did it. One had been bullied so much, he said he wanted to be put in the street and run over. One teen, who thankfully did have a friend, found her beautifully decorated locker on her birthday vandalized by the other kids who told her that everybody hated her. And the results were some of the things you would expect, suicidal ideation, school phobia, severe migraines, and many other negative outcomes. Part of the problem is the social isolation of children on the spectrum. In some small studies looking at how connected or disconnected kids on the spectrum were in school, they have found them very disconnected. In this first study of the 20 teens, 7 on the spectrum, almost all of the typical teens were very, hooked in to their social network at school. Well, 71% of those on the spectrum are either isolated with no friends or peripheral with just some acquaintances they can maybe say hi to. In that larger study of younger kids, 2nd through 5th grade, they found the kids on the spectrum experience lower acceptance, companionship, and reciprocity. So we can see they really do end up on the periphery, and that is not good when it comes to bullying. Notice here they said that the little kids didn't report greater loneliness. Later on, teens and adults on the spectrum do report loneliness. It may be they're a bit insulated at that age from the full impact of all that's going on. So it becomes a vicious cycle, right? Not having friends makes a child on the spectrum vulnerable to bullying. And then being a victim makes them even less likely to get friends. It's harder for kids to overcome that, they might be at risk of being victimized themselves if they reach out to someone who's a target. So this is the last thing they need, right? We're working so hard to help them with their social skills, conversational skills, friendship skills, trying to integrate them into the community. This is the last thing they need to be in this kind of humiliated status. Why are they socially isolated? I think we know being kind of socially blind is and just unable to read the social world easily and naturally is a core challenge for many on the spectrum. And that impacts knowing how to make friends, how to read other signals, understanding social hierarchies, like which clique is in power and who's at the head of that clique, knowing what's cool or gross. And so you might do something, you might pick your nose or something and have no idea of the social impact. You might not know all the hidden social rules. If the queen bee girl has put her handbag over the back of a chair and you sit in that chair after she has claimed it silently, you may find yourself in trouble. And of course, there's a million more examples like that. When we looked at what parents were saying about some of the traits their children had who tended to be bullied, those included clumsiness, poor hygiene, rigid rule keeping, enforcing adults' rules, which other kids do not like, continuing to talk about their favorite topic, their passionate favorite topic, even when others were bored and annoyed, frequent meltdowns, and inflexibility or rigidity. We dug in further, we found chances of being a victim, a bully, or a bully victim all increased when a child had those higher levels of autistic traits, meaning the social pieces and the repetitive, the intense interest in repetitive behaviors and rigidity. Or it also was higher if they had co-occurring conditions like anxiety and ADHD. Some of the things that were particularly upsetting to discover were that chances of being bullied in the past month, which is the way we phrased this question in our survey, increased for a child who had Asperger's versus autism or PDD and OS. And these kids were from DSM-4 days before we changed to ASD. Attended a public school or a school with a general education population, or were in a full inclusion classroom. All of that is bad news if we're trying to get the benefits of inclusion, but don't want our kids to be bullied. We also found children were more likely to present with internalizing symptoms like anxiety if they were being bullied. The bullies, on the other hand, the ones who are having the outbursts, had more emotional regulation issues like oppositional defiant disorder. They're more explosive. Bully victims, again, they had the worst of both worlds, both internalizing and externalizing, right? The anxiety and explosion. The frequency of bullying behaviors was associated with kind of a load of those psychological issues going on. The more they had, the worse it was. Bully victims specifically usually have chronic behavioral and emotional or developmental problems, much more likely to become a bully victim if you have those issues. Children with ASD and ADHD were 4 times more likely to bully than typical children in another study. And so you can just see that the emotional regulation piece comes up again and again. Why would kids with ASD become bully victims or even just be perceived as bullies? I want to dig into that a little bit. Part of it is many are prone to the meltdowns and a kind of acting aggressively, so that adds to that perception of them as bullies, whether they intended the aggression to mean anything or not. Sometimes there's limited social insight. They might engage in behavior they don't understand that other kids view as bullying. They might see bullying when it's not there, like misinterpret, and they could also, I would assume, be the other way. They might not see it when it is there. There's also the brutal honesty of ASD, because one thing I love about people on the spectrum is their kind of uncensored commentary on everything that's going on in the world. And they might just say, you're fat, you're bald, that dress is ugly, with no intent to socially slam someone or put them down. It's just a comment about what I happen to notice. But it could be viewed as bullying by the person that doesn't get that. One thing we found that happens all too often is that other kids learn how to push the buttons of children on the spectrum. They may provoke a meltdown on purpose. And often, because they're savvy enough to do that when nobody's looking, at least adults, they'll escape punishment. Well, the child on the spectrum gets sent home or suspended or whatever the consequences are. 52% of parents reported that had happened to their child in our study. You can imagine that if little Danny loves Pokemon and collects Pokemon and talks about Pokemon all the time, it just takes one kid going up and saying, hey, Danny, Pokemon are stupid, and there you go. Danny's going to maybe explode on you if he tends to do that. Some quotes from parents who are trying to explain why their kid was viewed as bullying give us some more insight. One said, my son doesn't realize he's bullying. He's trying to get the kids to pay attention to him. So he grabs their ball away or gets in their face when they say to stop. So the good news is the child wants to connect socially. The bad news is he doesn't know how, and the way he's going about it is making the other kids think of him as a bully. And the second one is they said their son had very set rules of behavior he expects all to follow. He doesn't see how his reaction to perceived slights or rule breaking is sometimes bullying. So this is a child that knows the rules and believes in the rules and tries to enforce the rules to such an extent that the kids who are maybe stepping out of line or doing whatever he doesn't like view it as bullying. One thing about these numbers, no matter how high they are, when you look at the studies based on parent-reported numbers, we're probably underestimating the problem. In this recent study of 35, like seniors in high school with ASD preparing for college, 51% reported they've been recent victims, but only 31% of their parents independently reported that in a separate interview. So that just illustrates that it's probably worse than we even think. I actually have a personal experience of that. Back when we were doing the Ian Bullying survey, I was at an IEP with my son. He was in high school. Everything was going actually pretty well at that point, I thought. And at the very end of this very happy, upbeat IEP, someone said, "So, Jeremy, tell us, is there anything else you want to say about how things are going?" And in that last minute of the IEP, he says, "Well, I'm being bullied at lunch." I had no idea. And if I'd been filling out a survey the day before, I would have said, "No, my child's not being bullied." So that just illustrates that point. Consequences are not good in the short term. These children that experience all these times of victimization, they report not enjoying school, not feeling safe at school, not feeling like they belong at school. All terrible outcomes, not surprising, but terrible. In a small study based on interviews with teens on the spectrum, they talked about losing their self-confidence, refusing to go to school or just giving up in homeschooling, feeling fearful and upset, going back in their shell when they had started to come out of their shell, and not feeling like they couldn't trust people anymore. 6 of the 10 felt that the bullying they experienced wasn't dealt with adequately at school. Evidence, by the way, does suggest the students with ASD do understand what bullying looks like. In this Australian study, they were actually better than typical kids at identifying bullying in vignettes. In other words, they gave them a printed out story about some dynamics between people, and they were really good at picking out regular and cyberbullying. So as they get older, and also if you think about if they're very intellectually able kids that are more out in the inclusion classrooms or the general education population, which is higher risk, so they probably get good at knowing what this is. In the long term, and this is for any victim of bullying, not just people with disabilities, bullying has long-lasting consequences for the victim, including loneliness, low self-esteem, mental health issues like depression and anxiety, diminished socioeconomic status into adulthood, and you'd have to imagine that's because of all the weight and the issues that have come from this, and it doesn't toughen you up. In a quite recent study of typically developing college students, past bullying was associated with depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. So all of this are terrible consequences that we need to avoid. As we go on to look at kind of solutions, it's kind of important to note in the bigger picture here, it's part of the human dilemma, that we're social animals who need each other with a capacity for connection and love and sacrifice. And I have the wolves here because they're also social animals. But we also have a pecking order in which we vie for status as individuals and in groups within the larger social context. And the social context is really important when it comes to humans because it can be toxic or it can be good. I'm going to talk about that too. Bullying is an inherently social act. And when theorists go and try to figure out why do humans do this in every corner of the globe, Why do they do this? Theories about it aren't about some individual problem, like people are just born bullies and there's a problem with those. People that are born to bully, they're all social psychological or sociological. Things like social capital theory, dominance theory, theory of humiliation, and organizational culture. So solutions aren't going to be just with individuals. Meanwhile, in this huge social issue, the children with ASD are socially isolated, socially naive often, sometimes a little bit behind in their social development. You can picture a sixth grader who's more like a third grader in terms of the way they're still thinking about the social world and the dynamics at school. So how do we reduce their vulnerability to bullying? I'm going to try and look at different levels of the problem, again, because it's a social problem, starting with the target, the bully, families, peers, school personnel, the institutional climate, which in this case is often the school, but that does extend to the workplace. There is workplace bullying, and society itself. If you're starting just with a child on the spectrum, how do you bully-proof them? I mean, you start by trying to target the core challenges, usually the social ones, right? Helping them with conversational ability, friendship skills, social skills of all kinds. We're trying to ameliorate and address conditions, those co-occurring conditions that interfere, like anxiety or ADHD. You involve the parents coordinating and communicating with the school, right? For example, if the teachers notice that this little boy comes in every day, eats oatmeal in the cafeteria and smears it all over his shirt, and then is bullied relentlessly the rest of the day over the mess on his shirt, then there needs to be coordination with the parents and the school to figure that out and to find solutions. If you start to help him learn not to put the oatmeal on his shirt, but maybe there's other solutions too in the meantime, like bringing spare shirts to school, making sure that he never spends the day in that shirt. Another thing parents can do is talk with and support the child. This Bully Project Parent Toolkit that I will provide the resource to at the end, they talk about how to support the child, what not to do and what to do, how to contact the teacher and go beyond the teacher if you're not satisfied with what happens after a bullying incident, all the way up to the school board. They encourage you to know the bullying policy for the school and or district, and the state law or policy about bullying, if any, and they provide a resource and listing of state law and policy by state. They also mentioned that if all else fails, you can go to the U.S. Office for Civil Rights and make a claim there, because your child's civil rights are being violated if ongoing bullying occurs. Well, what often happens, in talking about real incidents I've seen and real cases I've seen, sometimes people don't have the time and energy and will to even want to bother going up the line. And you'll find sometimes people need a new context and fresh start too. Because if things have gotten really terrible in a certain classroom or a certain school, I find often what families do is they try a new class in the school or a new school. Sometimes, depending on their child, they might be trying to find a more special education class or school. Those tend to be more protective than the inclusion class or school. They might be trying for a non-public school. Those are the school district funded separate schools, or just plain old private school. You know, I've seen people take their kid out and put them in Catholic school or something like that. Doesn't mean Catholic school doesn't have bullies either, but again, they're just trying to get a fresh start. People also homeschool. I can think of an incident where many of these solutions were tried. There was a little girl, very bright little girl with a kind of an Asperger's profile, loved Star Wars, that was her passion, had terrible anxiety. And one of the solutions the school was trying was they had a little pop-up house, little pop-up tent in the room, and that was supposed to be her place to go when she was upset or anxious, to use her strategies to calm herself. So she walks in one day, and the kids put a foreclosed sign on her house and tell her she can't have her house anymore. And this happens again and again. and escalates. And this is a family that eventually first pulled her right out and started homeschooling, then started paying for a private school for children with social challenges, and then eventually I think went to non-public school. But you can see when I look at the things going on in front of me, that's often what's happening. The bully and the bully victim too, right, can also receive some attention. I'm not really going to go into the details on that, but both school counseling and family interventions have been recommended for bullies in general. My guess is with bully victims, it's going to be more the same things as a child with ASD in general. What about the kids around them? You know, one goal is to increase the empathy and skills of the typically developing students, therefore increasing the social integration of the kids on the spectrum. You know, you want the kids in the spectrum to be on the school newspaper or the yearbook or the play or something, so they at least are connected in some way with the other kids and help the other kids learn to recognize autism and have more empathy for it. This study from the Netherlands shows how important that is. They looked at how peers treated other kids, you know, kids with disabilities who they saw bullied. They were more likely to intervene when it was really obvious that the child had a disability, so Down syndrome or a kid in a wheelchair, say. But they were more likely to reject and not assist students with ADHD or autism. And part of that is because unless you kind of know what you're looking at, it's invisible to people, or they're misinterpreting what people are doing as just weird or whatever. So it suggests educating the school community about ASD is critical. Training is crucial when it comes to the teachers and staff at school. Not only do they need to recognize autism and have the same empathy we want from the peers, but they need to recognize and intervene in bullying as well. And you can see in this study that this is a speech and language pathologist embedded in the schools. Many did see bullying as a big problem for their clients with ASD in the school. Most felt comfortable intervening in bullying, but not all. 78% were in a district with an anti-bullying campaign, but only 20% were in a district where that campaign focused on children with special needs. And that is, again, something you want to lobby for. Teachers can increase supervision in high-risk areas, like where? Where are the places where these things happen? The cafeteria, right? The locker room, the bus, you know, the playground. And also have ongoing teacher discussions about what they're seeing, because what you find again and again is that teachers and staff are reluctant to take action when they're not sure what happened. When they consult with each other, it helps them to get a clearer idea that something toxic is going on and needs to be addressed. School climate and culture plays a big role too. I'm talking here about Paula Cluse because she wrote the book on inclusion for children with autism and talks about the school climate and culture. For inclusion itself, you need committed leadership, you know, from the teacher all the way up to the principal and beyond. Democratic classrooms that value each student, reflective educators who are thinking about what's going right and wrong and sensitively adapting for all the kids with all the differences, and a supportive school culture that celebrates diversity itself. Unfortunately, as we've seen in the data, inclusion is not always done right. We're finding that bullying is increasing when children are in these general ed or public school settings or an inclusive setting. And I would say that's data that a parent could use to critique the practices at the school, to say that if you think you're committed to inclusion, then you can't permit this bullying to go on. And again, and talk about school culture. The anti-bullying programs we do have are in place because, unlike back in the day when they just said, oh, you know, let kids be kids and it'll toughen them up, you know, and tell them to go out and hit the kid back and all of that, that stopped when studies started showing, you know, there was a correlation between suicide and bullying, and even more so when the Secret Service did a study of school shooters and found that many of the perpetrators of school shootings had been harassed and perceived themselves at least as harassed or bullied. So suddenly reducing bullying became on the agenda for schools. Many of them now have anti-bullying programs, and you can use those when you go in there to say, hey, this is what it says you're supposed to be doing. Why aren't you doing it? Because the problem is they aren't always followed, and they also aren't often evaluated. If you think about it, to actually know if it's working, the school needs to be collecting data on bullying before they implement it and after, and comparing, and that doesn't often happen. They're usually just saying, oh, it looks like a great program, and they're doing it, but they don't really know if it's effective. It does look like some anti-bullying programs are working. In a study reviewing 21 of them, the author found some bullying did decrease in some cases, and others it didn't. One piece that's interesting for us is that when bullying programs focused on LGBTQ issues, those students reported less harassment and more frequent and effective intervention by school personnel. And that's what we also want for our kids on the spectrum. So I assume the same would be true, that if the bullying program took some time to focus on understanding of ASD, that you would see likewise a good effect. Lastly, society at large has a role to play. The more there's a general philosophy of celebration of diversity of all kinds, likely going to benefit individuals with disabilities, including autism spectrum disorders and all those co-occurring conditions too, like anxiety. One thing that I find encouraging is that current college students, the ones who grew up with kids on the spectrum in those inclusive classrooms, those college students sitting in my classes now, seem so open and accepting and understanding of autism in a way that I don't think it would have been the case with my own cohort. Another encouraging trend is that some studies are showing bullying may actually be decreasing over time. Maybe inclusion and exposure and cultural shifts and anti-bullying programs are having an effect. This study from 2016 showed that bullying involvement is decreasing over time in the U.S. And another study looking all over the globe saw that in a third of 33 countries they looked at, bullying was decreasing, and one of those was the United States. So we can take heart from that. So maybe some of this is working and can be brought to bear to help the kids and teens on the spectrum. And lastly, here are the resources that I promised you. The first is a video, it's just on YouTube, from the National Autism Society. It starts with a vignette of a typical kid being teased and how he just turns it around and brushes it off and diffuses the situation. And then the exact same vignette, only the kid has autism, and how he is goaded into reacting, and then they end up punching him on the ground. In addition, they have interviews with several young adults on the spectrum who talk about how devastating bullying in school was for them. This would not be a bad video to share if you were in a situation with the school and trying to make your point about why action has to be taken. I also mentioned the Bully Project. There's actually a movie they made called Bully, which you can get on iTunes, which goes into a lot about the devastation of bullying. But they also have these tools and resources online, a whole toolkit for parents and a special needs toolkit specifically, including how to talk about bullying at your child's IEP, how to bring it in and make it part of that, how to talk to other kids about disabilities, a sample letter to the school, etc. And with that, I guess I will stop talking and take some of the questions that have been collected. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. We did get a few questions in during your talk, but feel free to keep sending them in. So I'm just going to try and sort through. There might be some overlaps here. You talked a little bit about autistic individuals not being socially aware. So what role does an observer or parent play then at that point?
I guess part of it, I think what you mean is that, do you mean it's like the child doesn't understand they're doing something that's provoking bullies, or that's making them a target. I guess that's part of the explicit social skills training in a way, right? I mean, I would think if they don't realize that a certain behavior is causing a problem, like, I don't know, picking your nose or something, right? That's something that has to be explicitly taught. And I think sometimes one of the things that just happens all the time is that because autism is just invisible to the uninitiated, they don't understand that just exposure to typical kids isn't going to make these kids know all these social rules. I think it's like putting blind kids in with sighted kids and expecting them to pick up vision. They're not going to just pick it up. You know, they work really hard. They have to work really hard and be explicitly taught about some of these hidden social rules. So, you know, depending on the specific instance, you know, you'll be looking for what is the hidden social piece here that this child doesn't know, and how can we help make it clear for him with some of, I mean, there's techniques like social stories, like the cartoon conversations, you know, where they draw it out, make it visual, what kids are thinking when you do that, you know, maybe what you intended, but what's happening over here. I don't know if that helps. I hope that was what they meant.
Yeah, I think they were just wanting some more clarity around if it should be considered a teachable moment, and I think you addressed that. An additional question related to that would be, do you recommend observers or teachers, parents stepping in, or I guess would you say the teachable moment, use that and sort of see how things progress from there?
Well, if bullying is actually happening, I definitely think the teachable moment for the bully, not the victim, it's like I would say stop it now, but then try and figure out what's making the child a target. In the moment of upset, and if I was being bullied, I'd be upset, I don't think you're really open to learning anything from it. It's like you have to wait till people are in a calm place to start talking about you know, how you change your behavior. And remember I had on one of the slides, don't blame the victim, because you don't want to say, you know, if you didn't do that, they wouldn't do that to you. It was kind of like, let's work on some things to make it easier for you, or I don't know how you would phrase it, but you do not want to indicate that it's the child's fault, even though they can do some things to protect themselves. You know, it's like keep the fault where it belongs with the bullies. Is what I would say. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. So you shared a lot of research, and it was from a variety of ages. Have you come to a consensus about when bullying begins, or at what point parents should start talking to their school about anti-bullying?
I think elementary school. We saw that a quarter of those elementary school kids in the one study, a quarter of the kids with disabilities were had already experienced bullying. So definitely elementary school. And actually, if you think about it, maybe the kids are in a really open place in elementary school to learn about people that are different and stuff. Middle school is tougher as the kids start forming cliques and everything gets more complicated. Not that you don't do it there too, but I would say elementary school is a good time. I know there are elementary schools that do like a disability celebration day and things like that. Not just autism, but you know, they might have something about what is it like to be blind. You know, they have different booths around the gym. One where you can try being in a wheelchair. You know, they just do a whole variety of disability awareness piece, and then include autism in that, and explain autism as kind of not always understanding what's going on in the social piece, and they have a way to do that that's age appropriate when they do like a disabilities day. So you're trying to overtly educate even the little kids, you know, second grade and above, I guess. I think it is worth doing.
We have a question about some of the survey results that you showed, if that was representative of nonverbal individuals with autism in any way, or if there are data available about bullying in nonverbal individuals.
I don't know if there is. That's something I just don't have an immediate answer for. I would guess that has something to do, and again, I don't know because I haven't looked, but the pieces that stood out from our research was that if you were in the more protected kind of special ed environment, like in maybe a classroom that's a special ed classroom or in a special separated special ed school, you were at lower risk because you were just in a more protected space all the time. So if you were nonverbal and out in the regular classroom jungle, I would guess that would make you probably a target, not only autism but the nonverbal piece. But if you were in a more protected space, maybe not. So you'd have to look at where they were being educated too, I think, to get the full picture of what the impact of being nonverbal had.
Okay. You may not have this info, so we can certainly forward this on if we don't have it right away. But are you aware of sort of the legality behind bullying? So what rights do children or parents have if nothing is done by the school?
Partly that's going to depend on the state laws. So there's a federal piece, there's a state piece, and I'm no expert on the legal part, but I would refer them again to the Special Needs Toolkit on the Bully Project website, because that's where they actually have a list by state of the policies and or laws. Not every state has a law about bullying, but some of them do. And that's going to kind of change what your approach might be, if you're going up against the school. Now, sometimes the school is going to be helpful. I mean, I know that like when my son was having that cafeteria incident, they rallied right around it. They started patrolling the cafeteria when he was going to be there. They started diffusing it. They talked to the bullies, and it stopped. So you can have some success, but you also hear so many times where you don't, and it just keeps going. So at that point, you're looking at escalating from teacher to principal and up the line, seeing what the policies are in your state, seeing what the policy, if there's an anti-bullying policy in the school, and kind of trying to go from all those directions, as you go up the line, trying to fight. And I guess that's what I would say, not being a lawyer.
Okay, thank you. That was helpful. You have some resources that you've shared. Do you have any recommendations for tools that are specifically for teachers, educators, sort of lesson plans or videos that might be helpful for this group?
I don't immediately on hand, but I'm sure I could come up with some.
Okay.
I'm trying to think. I've got. I know I've got somewhere how to talk, to your students about disability, and certainly I have a lot of educators who are my students and who are definitely engaged in trying to talk about disability, all the way with kindergartners even, and changing their language depending on what age group they're with. So let me see if I can, after the fact, come up with something there.
Okay. So do you have any recommendations? We've had some questions about bullying in adults or in the workplace. Do you have any references or info that you can share about this topic?
It's still early days in this topic. I know in a survey they did in the UK, there were many people who had attempted work who were bullied at work. And I forget what the number was. I think it was about 30%. I need to go back and look at that. But it is a concern. The truth is we kind of have this fantasy that bullying for everybody just stops, that we grow out of it. But we know now that that really isn't true. It's less prevalent. It doesn't happen as much in adult life, but it does happen in the workplace, and it does happen at college. And so we have a lot less information about that, but definitely, adults. We just don't. I don't have any data on that right now, but we should have every expectation that we need to be ready for that, and not expect it to not occur.
Okay. I just want to remind everyone that we will post these slides to our website in the coming days, as well as a recording of this talk. So all of the resources will be available soon on our website that are shared in this deck here. So we're kind of running low on some questions. Feel free to keep sending them in. Connie, feel free to share anything that you might not have been able to touch on if you want to go back to any slides. Otherwise, if we don't get any more questions, we can end early.
Let's see. Well, let me think about that.
No worries.
I'm just trying to think of other real-life incidents that I've seen. I guess one group I could talk about, speaking of adults, I could talk about the research I'm doing now. What I'm doing now is exploring young adult outcomes and interviewing families of young adults and the young adults themselves. And I just wanted to say that what comes through in those interviews is that children, folks that were bullied as children, they do not forget it. It sticks with them. It's something that spontaneously is brought up in interviews with these young adults. They remember it vividly. They feel like they still have effects from it. I've even had someone say, I can't tell you about it because my brain won't let me remember that. So one thing that you definitely want to bring forward if you are having a discussion about preventing bullying of your child is that it is not a temporary short-term issue, that there's really long-lasting effects. And that the kids on the spectrum do know it's happening and they do remember, and it does affect them as they need to go out and they want to reach out and they're wanting to make connections. That history of bullying does not help.
Thank you for sharing that. We had a comment that whenever you're done with that study, it would be helpful to maybe do a follow-up about this topic. We did have a couple questions come in the last few minutes. If you can answer maybe some strategies to help when teachers are doing the bullying or how to approach this.
Well, yeah. I've heard about that more than once, right, where there's a teacher that doesn't get, in quotes, doesn't get the child at all, doesn't understand autism, maybe resents having the child in their class. I'm guessing that happens more when you're in a kind of a general education setting. My teachers will even tell me, my teachers that are in my classes will even tell me about how there'll be some teacher that because they've been so awful, they're almost rewarded by not having any more kids put in there, and they're giving them all to the one who's good with the kids with autism because that one was so terrible to the ones with autism, which in a way is rewarding them for being terrible. But I definitely would take that, as far as you had to take it to the principal or whoever and up the line. It's the principal, the district, it goes the principal, the superintendent, right, et cetera. And again, if you have the energy to do that, is it as simple as get them in a different classroom and to insist on that, or do you have to leave the school? My son had an issue like that in the 4th grade. He got this most horrible teacher. She just, she was going to retire in a year, so they didn't want to do anything about her. She had a terrible reputation forever, but she was finally going to retire. And so, it was clear they weren't going to directly do anything. And that year was the year he really went downhill and kind of decompensated. He did end up in a special needs school for the year and a half after that. He actually ended up leaving the school, not because we initially wanted him to, but because he was having such a hard time with this teacher. So I do understand that. I think you take all the policies. Again, you've got your anti-bullying policy if it exists. You've got your state law and policy if it exists. You've got just your child's well-being and what they say in this bully website is, to bring it into the IEP as part of, if they're trying to work on social skills, you have to protect this child from bullying, right? But when it comes to a teacher, I think it's more powerful. You're going to definitely confront that. but you see how far you get. I mean, the problem is the school climate and culture you're in, right? And if it's kind of toxic all the way through, or if it's only toxic with her, him, whoever, the teacher, how far you get and what you decide to do next.
Okay. So I think we're going to end here. I apologize if we didn't get to everyone's questions. Some are quite specific to certain instances, so it's hard for us to provide advice for, say, one individual circumstance. So, again, apologize.